Thank you, John. I'd like to begin by endorsing the remarks that Anthony made about the organisers of this conference. I think their work has been meticulously executed, and it's the reason why we've had such an excellent weekend. I hope I don't spoil it. I'd also like to endorse what Michael said about my good friend Colin Montford. I'm sure that his memory has been in the minds of many of us during this conference. Now, my talk is going to consist of two parts. The longest part is what John and the organisers know about, which begins here. The second part is this, which is what they don't know about in case they withdrew the invitation. Because I intend to leave you, being the final speaker at the conference, with something to think about, not just about Hetton, but the history that went before Hetton. And the significance of this, of course, is 2025 and the whole interpretation of railway history that arises from 1875. So we'll come back to that later. Good. I'm used to having a chalk and a blackboard, you know. The study of Hetton Colliery and its railway is important, I suggest, for two reasons. One, to the mining historian, it is the conquest of the Magnesian Plateau. To the railway historian, of course, it's the beginning of the illustrious career of George Stephenson. Now, to look at the mining history, first of all, because I don't think you can divorce the two. Hetton paved the way for the opening up of the East Devon Plateau by William Coulson. This led, of course, to the massive colonisation of Durham in the second half of the 19th century. And it also had international implications because Coulson and his team were responsible for example, developing the Ruhr coalfield in Germany. And one of his family actually ended up in the Far East developing coal mining there. Just to remind ourselves of the importance of the Great Northern Coalfield and its expansion during the period prior and after the opening of Hetton. This was, in its time, not only the largest coalfield in Britain, but it was also the largest coalfield in the world. And when Hetton was opened in 1822, we're not talking of just another colliery. We're talking about a major enterprise of world stature. It's also important to remind ourselves of the different types of trade that was conducted by the colliery owners. By far the most important trade was the sea sail trade, and this was supplying principally London, but also other areas of the southeast of England with domestic coal. It had nothing to do with the Industrial Revolution. It was supplying domestic coal for the homes of principally Londoners. The small coal generally marketed around about 5 shillings a cauldron. In contrast, the sea sail trade marketed it round about 28 shillings a cauldron. So you see the the enormous difference between the two elements of the trade. Now, I would just like to dwell a little bit on this statement of one of my former teachers, Norman McCord, Emeritus Professor at the University of Newcastle. The remains of this great industrial interest are amongst the most precious elements in the region's archaeological heritage. For the collieries and the states, the wagonways and the pit villages provide a vital element in the world's energy supplies during a major period of historical transformation. And I think it's important that we widen our vision and focus on the international consequences of Hetton in our deliberations this weekend. Right. It might be Sunday, but you're still getting homework. It's nothing complicated. I just want you to write a short history of the world. And what I want you to consider is what elements of the rich history of the Northeast would be included in this history. Hadrian's Wall? Not a chance. Not a chance. It was simply part of a defense system of a Mediterranean empire. Bede, Lindisfarne, perhaps because of the introduction of Christianity to Western Europe. Perhaps a footnote. The cathedrals and castles and the medieval history of the Northeast, not a chance. Here we were economic backwater, a defence buffer between England and Scotland. But when we come into the early historical period, it is then that the Northeast comes to the fore. And scholars have suggested that the colliery at Wickham, the Grandleys Colliery at Wickham, and the Crowley Ironworks at Nuneaton and Swalwell were the early elements of the Industrial Revolution, which placed the Northeast at the forefront of this development, not the mills of Manchester. Manchester was an insignificant village at the time that these places were in operation, and both of them had railways, as we'll come to in a minute. I suggest to you that the railway and the steam logograph are arguably the region's greatest technological achievement. That George and Robert Stephen were preeminent among the engineers of the Northeast who contributed to this achievement, and of course Hetton was George's first complete railway. That would go into a history book of the world, not least because of the fact that 60% of the world's railways operate on a gauge that was determined by the backside of a horse grazing on the Roman wall in Byker. But that's another lecture. Let's look at the timeline. We are celebrating the 200th anniversary of Hetton this weekend, because it was an iron railway and it used principally steam power. But what I want you to do is to cast your minds back for more than 200 years before that date, when railways were introduced into the northern coalfield. And I want to look at particular what was happening in the early years of the 17th century. One of the first mentions we have of railways is a report of Aladdin Colliery that dates to 2021. And a complaint was put into the court of the South Chamber that part of the loss was stables built for wagon horses, a direct mention of a railway. And also in the parish records of Wickham, we find the first mentioning of people's names associated with railways. And interestingly enough, the first railway worker that we know about was a woman that looked after the gate at Wickham and at the top of Logley Hill Bank, and this was Widow Halborn. And we interestingly see from the very beginning there are problems of people being killed by wagons. However, there is even an earlier reference to railways. This is a map in the Duke's collection, Duke of Northumberland's collection, of the Castle Ward part, southeast Northumberland. And this section shows Newcastle and the major collieries surrounding Newcastle. Some of these collieries have railways attached to them. They are difficult to see, but there's two of them in the Ousburn Valley. And to my knowledge, this is the first map that we have of a railway in the northeast. Now, railways weren't confined to coal mines. The vast majority of them were built for coal mines, but there are others. And Crowley's famous iron works at Swalwell has one of these railways marked on them. It is a bit difficult to see, but if we come from the steel furnace down to the bottom of the map through M, L and N, this was a railway connecting the furnace with the wharf on the River Derwent at Swalwell. This was the largest steelworks in Western Europe. Is it not possible that this was an iron railway rather than a wooden one? Did we have to wait half a century for somebody at Coalbrookdale to have the wit to put a bit of metal on top of a bit of wood? And there are other circumstantial evidence that this could have been an iron railway, but I haven't time to go on to that at the moment. This map is a one which I drew about 10 years ago, and it shows the wagonways of the Great Northern Coalfield, and there was somewhere in the order of 89 combinations of wagonways feeding into the different states on the River Tyne and the River Tees. So then, there was a lot happening before Hetton came on the scene, and it's this which I want to spend some time talking about. Firstly, as is so often the case, these are not to be demeaned as simple tram roads. Something that happened in the rural part of Northumberland and Durham prior to the real business of railways starting in 1825. A first piece of evidence that these were railways is this map. You'll notice that in the bottom left-hand corner, the Washington Wagonway is called a railway. This map dates to around about 1800, 1801. And here we have a line feeding the Washington States with an on-road and an off-road, but it's also feeding the bottle works, and next door is the lead works, and it continues off the map to feed a shipyard. But don't take that as the only evidence that railways were around before Stockton and Darlington. Let me introduce you to a group of railway enthusiasts of the 18th century. Not an anorak among, some you'll say. Firstly, the representative of the Swedish Iron Founders Association, man of great significance who visits Crowley's works. Sir John Clark, a great coal owner in the Midlothian area of Scotland, a man who came down to this part of the world, as many others did, to visit the Roman remains of Hadrian and others. But first of all, he went along the Plessy Wagon Way, and then he went to see the steam engines at Byker belonging to the Ridley family. William Stukeley, great archaeologist, man who excavated Stonehenge. I'll come back to him in a minute. The Earl of Oxford, who visited Chesley Street and saw the steam engine there, and the two wagonways coming from the west, and the French academician, Gabriel Jars, which I'll come back to in a moment. Stukeley took a break away from his tour of the Roman wall in 1725, to visit Colonel Liddell's works at Tanfield. And two things struck him as incredible. One, of course, was the Causey Arch, which we are well familiar with, but what most people that visit Tanfield don't see is the massive engineering achievement of the embankment across the burn. This was what was notable to not just Stukeley, but also to others in the 18th century. Augustine, as I said, visited Crowley's works, and these comments must have been made at Winleighton Mill, because here we're at the bottom of one of the steep drops on the Pontoff line to Winleighton Mill, and he noticed that when it was raining it was all rather dangerous, and that from time to time a wagon would run downhill out of control and smash against the other wagons. Gabriel Jars visited, first of all, the massive colliery at Walker, which was 100 fathoms deep, the first in the coalfield to reach that depth. And it was powered by two massive steam engines with 72 and 73-inch cylinders, which astounded this man. He then went on to visit a wagonway, and this was the Pontoff line. He tells us that, and interestingly enough, he uses the word railway. Le chemin le plus, the most important railway belongs to Butte, and this was the Pontoff line. And notice what he says, the railway is almost always covered in wagons. In other words, these weren't rural branch lines. These were massive mainline freight lines. And that's what we're dealing with. Now, I want to examine that point that he makes in a little more detail. But before we do, he would have undoubtedly encountered the high-level bridge over that carried the Pontoff line over the Derwent Valley at what we now call Rowland's Gill. This is from the Duke's art collection. And it is in itself a massive structure. Perhaps not as grand as the thing that Robert put up 100 years later, but nonetheless a very important structure for its day. And I want to examine the point he made by referring to the Tanfield Way, because the statistics arrive. On the left-hand corner there, you've got the traffic of the Tanfield Railway as demonstrated by the VEND, which was the allocation that the collieries received for their quota of coal to be shipped from the river. And it adds up to just over 300,000 tonnes. Now, with a wagon capacity, which we know was 30.5 hundredweights, the loads to be carried were just over 200,000. Now, what follows next is a bit of creative guesswork. We know that the number of days was probably round about 225, because for much of the year, this line was closed because of the weather conditions. This gives us an average number of loaded wagons of 896, double that for the empties returning, and this takes us down to 150 wagons each in the 12-hour day. Now, this amounts to a wagon about every 24 seconds. Now, when I was a train spotter at the central station, if you got a train every 20 minutes rather than 24 seconds, it was a good day. That's an exaggeration, but you see the point I'm making. So again, these are not insignificant railways. I just want to look at the technology for the benefit of newcomers to this for a little time. This is from John Gibson's map of 1787, and the cartouche illustrates the railway of the day. On the far left-hand side is St Nicholas's, the tower of St Nicholas's Church, and we've got a colliery on the right-hand side, and in between we've got the alpine scenery of Jesmond. What looks like the Angel of the North is in fact a wind gin for winding at the colliery, but this is a modern colliery. Steam power is being used at this date, not just for pumping, but probably for winding. But if we just focus our attention on the railway for a minute and start beside the cathedral at the top left-hand side there, you'll see the man is getting off and attaching his horse to the back. Not, I hasten to add, to act as a brake. The reason for this is that the horse was the most valuable element on the railway. And the last thing you did was to run the risk of injuring your horse. And you can see him coming down with the horse trotting behind, sitting on the brake to bring the loaded wagon to this large wooden structure at the riverside. And incidentally, the round things at the base there are wagon wheels, not grindstones. And the horse takes the wagon back to the colliery. We've got some interesting pictures of horses from maps of the period. These are from a map of Birtley, and you see the horse with a terror in its eyes going downhill past the Birtley service station of today. And then it's on its way back and the other twos. But let's not forget that horses were an important element of railways right up until Newmarket Charlie was disbanded by the British Rail Board in 1967, if my memory serves me right. But also let's not forget that during the period that we'll be talking about, horses were used extensively underground. And the last horses in this area that were used in the mines were in 1993 when Ellington closed in Northumberland. But they continued to be used on minor railways in Wales, for example, for long after that date. And that's an interesting map of an area which now houses Freeman Hospital and the tax office, the revenue office, which pays our pensions. So it's this is what existed before, the wagonway from West Longbenton to the Tyne, and you can see the horses being used on that, and you can see the nature of the wagonway, a series of branches moving on to the main line. Now in 2013, we had the good fortune to uncover what was a section of 18th century wagonway in one of the former shipyards at Wallsend. And amazingly, this was a few hundred yards from the house of the great engineer John Buddle, whose archives we have in the Mining Institute. And Buddle writes in his diaries a description of what the main way was. And he tells us it was a double line, double rail, and you can see in the diagram there what I mean, but this is the first recording of the double rail in an excavation. The bottom rail and the badly corroded upper rail above it. Now that line turned out to be 4 foot 8.5 inch width, and it was connected directly to Stephenson's line at Killingworth, and we have through that the connection with the standard gauge. Besides the main line, which was heavily engineered, there was a line, the byway, return way, which was lightly engineered. This was a single rail with shallow cuttings, and it quite often ran for the full length of the railway, but not always. And that was, of course, the Ernest excavation in 1996 at Lambton Colliery. There were some special features on the wagonways, one of which was the wagon pond, which was to soak the wooden wagon wheels on the return journey to the pit. Much the same was happening in Constable's famous picture of the Haywain. In order to stop the wagon wheels drying out and cracking and being unusable, they ran them into water. And amazingly, this is what was discovered in 2013. On the left-hand side is the standard gauge wagonway, mainway. The loop line is the byway. And in August it started to rain, and it filled the wagon point as you would expect. Another excavation that's happened recently is up at the west end of Newcastle at Cuthead on the wagonway up to Callington. This is interesting for a number of reasons. Widow Grace Ainley's pasture was where George Stephenson got his first railway job, looking after the cattle on Ainsley's pasture and preventing them from strolling onto the wagonway. But if you look at the LiDAR image, I hope with the assistance of my drawing, you can pick out the wagonway system leading to cut-end junction, which you hopefully can also pick out, and down to the States at Leamington. Now, it's difficult to give an impression of the scale of this cutting, but here you can, I hope, see the railway at the bottom of the excavation trench, which had to be stepped in order to enable access. And perhaps you can get an indication of it by simply looking at the hedgerow and seeing how it's falling away. That is what it would have looked like. Not with an A4, I hasten to add. But this is Hetton Junction. This is the embankment at Hetton Junction, and it would have been similar at Cut End. So then, what I've been trying to show you in terms of technology, the railway was well developed by the time we get to Hetton. Also, steam power was well in use by the time we get to Hetton. And this is a diagram that shows 2 steps of steam power in use at the collieries on Tyne and Wear. The red lines are stationary steam engines introduced on the Euston-Irpeth Railway down to both the Wear and the Tyne in around about 1807. And there are others, as you can see. And the others are the numerous railways which were using steam power, admittedly as an experimental, during the experimental period, because of the high price of not just horses, but also their feed during the Napoleonic era. There was an extensive trial of steam engines, as I hope that indicates. So this brings me to one of the first major points I want to make. This is a postcard which I bought recently at Stephenson's cottage on sale by the National Trust, one of the guardians of our heritage. How on earth can you call Stephenson the father of the railway if you know anything about what had happened in the previous 200 years? We'll come back to this point of fathers of railways. Let's just look at the development of Hetton now and focus in on that. This is a map of Hetton in 1776, and you notice in the top northwest corner there is the pit field marked, and this was a pit that was mining the coal nearer the surface, not underneath the great limestone plateau. This eluded colliery engineers for quite some time. In fact, many of them, including eminent people like John Buddle, believed that if coal existed at all under the plateau, it would be of an inferior sort. Singing began at the Lion's Pit there, which is some distance from what became the Lion's Colliery, about a mile distance. But that's where it all started. And it wasn't unsuccessful at first. Stephenson was invited in 1819 to produce a quotation for the development of the colliery. And I would just like to examine this in some detail, because it shows us what Stephenson and his brother was about at Hetton at this time. A large amount of money is allocated for the continuing the work, sinking the shaft near Crutter's house. And then there is a series of quotes for pumping engines, winding engines, making what was then a branch line, which would later become the main line, down to what we would later call the Hetton pit, and erecting engines for the inclined planes, and buying coal wagons. What is interesting also of this quotation is that Stephenson is quoting for 600 cauldrons, whereas the previous developments had only been for 30,000 cauldrons. Oh, sorry, I've pressed the wrong button again. Now, if we try to translate this into graphical form, don't worry about reading all the text. What I want to get across to you is the totality of what the railway was, because the engineer's job was to get the coal from the coal face to the shaft, up the shaft, onto the overland railway, and then down to Sunderland. So we have two major seams being operated at the colliery. Each of these major seams has a steam engine underground, which is operating an inclined plane. There are also 5 gravity-worked inclined planes underground, bringing the coal from the rise side of the colliery down to the shaft. There are 2 shafts at Hetton, and each of these shafts ends up with having 2 winding engines, and the Blossom pit has the major pumping engine. So there's a great deal of steam power involved in getting the coal to the surface. And there's a great deal of horsepower on the railway underground getting the coal to the shaft. Once we get to the service, before we get there, this is a plan that was drawn up by Nicholas Wood after a major explosion at the colliery in 1860. And it's useful for us because it actually shows the railways and the engines operating the railways underground. And it also shows the stables, the engine sheds of the underground railway. We are fortunate to have in the Hare collection 2 shots of underground railways. These date from the late 1830s at Walbottle Colliery, and the left-hand side one shows the interchange between the rolleyway and the wagonway and the horses unloading coves. This section shows the eye of the colliery, the bottom of the shaft, and the railway coming to it. Note that there weren't cages at this time. It wasn't until the late 1830s that cages were introduced. This is what would have been the scene at Hetton when it opened. This is from a valuation of Neyman Colliery at Newbottle, but it just gives you some idea of the extent of the underground railway system. At Newbottle, the total underground was 12,000 yards. The total on the surface was just below 16,000 yards. So we're not talking about minor railways underground, we're talking about a major railway system underground. And I'd like to remind you that despite the massive use of horsepower on the surface, horses were still used at Hetton on the surface. And here on Hare's famous drawing of the colliery, we see 2 horses marked, and they're used for marshalling the trains before the steam engines got hold of them. Now, steam engines were a late addition to the planning of Hetton Colliery. This is from an amended estimate from the 1819 one, and even as late as 1821, Stephenson was not talking about locomotives at Hetton. The first we hear about it is in October when he sends a letter to William James, a man who was associated with the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, and he tells them that 3 engines are being built for a neighbouring colliery, which is undoubtedly Hetton. So let me ask ourselves the question, why was this change to locomotives, which you must bear in mind were new technology at the time, with all the problems? Was it the influence of Stephenson that caused the change, or was it the influence of young Robert coming on the scene, because he did visit Hetton? Or was it the influence of William James, or perhaps George Dodd, a manager of the railway, who was a firm enthusiast of the locomotive, and would later go on to build locomotives in Scotland? Or was it just simply the financial state of the company that they decided to go onto locomotives rather than use horses? I don't know, but I raise that question with you. Now, I'm not going to spend a great deal of time talking about the railway because I know John has done this already, but I'll just quickly remind you of what it was about. The horses organise the train. The train is taken to the bottom of Woden Law by one of the locomotives. It's taken up the banks by the 2 stationary engines. When it gets to the top of Woden Law, there's a series of gravity-led in-kind planes taking it down. And I love the drawings of these early graphical artists. You know, they really want to inspire, don't they? And then it gets onto another level section where the locomotives take over. It passes by the Landsale Depot at Chester Road in Sunderland, Sargeable Depot itself, and then it lands up at the Staith. And the Staith was an amazing structure. What you've got there at the terminus of the railway is a massive wooden structure for storing coal, because the production of the colliery wasn't synchronized to the sale of coal. More or less, the production of the colliery was the same from month to month. The railway operated from month to month as well. But the principal export of the coal from the river took place in a limited period from the summer to the autumn of the year. And the coal was not acceptable to the market if it was weathered. So that's why you need these massive structures, not just of the Staith, but that great building behind is a storage depot. But the thing that most interests me as a railwayman, rather than as a mining historian, is that. Because what we've seen along this railway is a series of signal galleries. So this line, contrary to what the S&D would have you believe, was a line that was operated by signals. Was this transport system a success or failure? Just let's consider some of the arguments. My good friend Colin, a late good friend Colin, wrote the following in his celebrated book, The Railways of County Durham, that the railway proved far from satisfactory. And he began to quote the reports of the eminent engineer Chapman, who had built railways himself, built steam engines himself, designed steam engines himself, and he ended up that it was far from satisfactory because the cast iron rails broke. There were frequent breakages of the ropes. The horses were withdrawn from the nose section, and the handling of the slates was questionable. Robert Stephenson, that's the brother of George, was replaced in 1823 by Joseph Smith, the colliery engineer that operated Chapman's locomotives at Hetton Colliery, now in the east end of Newcastle. Well, I don't really agree with Colin on that point. And the reason why I don't agree with him, I'll come to in a minute. This is just to point out that Chapman himself was an eminent railway engineer. One of the reasons I don't agree with him is when we examine the account books which are in the Mining Institute, and they're complete for 13 years, we get a graph which shows us that the railway operated more or less smoothly during this period. There were hiccups, as you expect, but the railway operated more or less smoothly. The reason why there were problems is because of the massive expansion of the traffic on the railway caused by the great increase in production at the colliery. And the figures, I think, speak for themselves. So we end up in the first year of the railway carrying just over 40,000 cauldrons of coal, and the engines doing just under 20,000 miles, with just a few years later, just before the death of Lyon himself, the railway is handling now almost 100,000 cauldrons and the engines are travelling almost 50,000 miles. So I suggest to you that a lot of the complaints that Chapman had to make were really taking points of a massive civil engineering project that was being asked to do a great deal more than it was originally designed for. And if we take the story a bit further, when Ellamore comes into operation, we see a continued increase in the traffic on the railway and a continued increase in the mileage of the locomotive. And of course, one of the points I think we should bear in mind is that the railway embarked, as was pointed out yesterday by Michael, upon the construction of the second generation of locomotives at the Bishop Wearmouth factory, ironworks, in the late 1840s, early 1850s, and to some extent these were modelled on what had gone before because it worked. It did the job that the colliery was asking it to do. And perhaps one of the great credits of all is that the railway lasted for 150 years. So yes, there may have been problems at the beginning, but I don't think we can call the railway a failure for the reasons that have just operated. What's its significance? It's interesting that Stephenson is not mentioned on the publicity that Mowbray drew up for the opening ceremony of the railway. He's not mentioned, and probably the reason is that he left to engage as being engaged as the engineer of the Stockton and Darlington, his second major project. But let's just try to summarise what the railway meant. It was not the introduction of new technology. I've tried to show to you that all of the technology, with the possible exception of the signalling, was not new. Cast iron rails were used, but Stephenson wanted the Birkenshaw rails, but he was overruled by the company. Horses, locomotives, station engines, gravity work planes, and of course signalling. This was not new technology. The thing that amazed contemporaries was the scale of the operation, the sheer size. And we have an important document because the line was visited, along with other railways in the country, by two Prussian German engineers in 1826-27. And they had this to say about Hetton. More than 5 million hundredweight must be brought to the colliery, to the depot and shipping place at the right bank of the River Wear above Sunderland by this great 8-mile railway each year. It was the scale of things that not only amazed people locally, but it amazed foreigners as well. It was not only the largest coal mine and most productive railway in Britain, but in the world. And that is no mean heritage. Now, I must emphasize to you that although there was some land sail trade carried by the Hetton Railway, the overwhelming amount of the coal was for the sea sail trade from the Wear down to London and the southeast. This was Stephenson's first railway, his first fully designed railway. And that we need to bear in mind. But of course it is followed so shortly after by his second full-scale railway, the Stockton and Darlington. And Cuneo's print here conjures up all the great excitement of the time. But let's look at what the Stockton and Darlington line was. This is a diagram to show the railway from the pits, the 5 collieries that served the line from the West Auckland coalfield in the west to the port in the east. Now let's emphasise to you that this railway was built for the land sail trade, the inferior land sail trade, not the great sea sail trade. In 1830, there was a big inquiry into the supply of fuel to the capital conducted by the House of Commons and the House of Lords. They produced a massive report which contained a map. This map ended at Durham City. The Auckland coalfield, which was supplying at this time the Stockton and Darlington line, was not mentioned. As far as the big trade, the sea sail trade was concerned, it wasn't an entity. And this is borne out by the geography of the railway. If you look at the map, a diagram there, if it was designed as a sea sail line, it would surely have gone like the Clarence Railway did, straight to the port. But it doesn't. It meanders to Darlington before it actually gets to the port of Stockton, and then later in 1830, Middlesbrough, of course. And how significant is the logo of the company, which doesn't show us a locomotive. It shows us a horse pulling wagons, the traditional transport of the Colliery Railway. So, let's look at other comparisons with the two railways. Undoubtedly, the distance of the Stockton and Darlington was much greater than that of the Hetton line. The Hetton line was built on cast iron rails. Stephenson wanted the Birkenshaw rails, which he put on the Stockton and Darlington. Initially, there were three engines at Hetton. This is stationary engines, steam engines. Stockton and Darlington had two. Hetton had 5 income planes. Stockton and Darlington had 2. Hetton had 5 locomotives. Stockton and Darlington had 3. On the surface railway, horses were 2 at Hetton. There were numerous at Stockton, because that was the main form of power when the railway opened. And of course, what I've got there does not include the underground railways, which I've indicated to you had a massive amount of steam and railway technology at Hetton. I don't know, because the records don't exist, what the 5 collieries that the Stockton and Darlington were feeding into the Stockton and Darlington had, but rest assured, these were in no way to be compared to the achievement of Hetton. Bailey gives us, this is in his Agriculture of County Durham, gives us a complete list of all the collieries in County Durham in 1810. There were 21 collieries in the Auckland coalfield. Most of them employed between 10 and 15 men. Most of them were at a depth of 20 to 40 fathoms. Very few of them had any technology of the steam age. At that time I'm talking about. In total, they employed 297 men. He tells us that Hetton Colliery, in the north of the county, one of the big sea sail collieries, a predecessor of Hetton, was employing 400 men at a depth of just over 100 fathoms. But bear in mind, Hetton was 148 fathoms. It's a pity we can't add to this equation what was happening underground, but the records don't exist. Yeah, if we look at coal traffic of railways compared, in the Stockton and Darlington, the coal traffic is what you can see there, in total around about 150,000 tonnes. At Hetton, in 1829, it was just short of 400,000 tonnes. But if we go back further into two of the great railways of the 18th century, Pontop was carrying in 1753 2,380 in 800 odd tons, and Tanfield in 1836 was carrying over 300,000 tons. So these are not minor tramways we're talking about. These are major mainline mineral railways that we're talking about. And they compare very, very favourably with the Stockton and Darlington. Now I suggest to you that the Stockton and Darlington's reputation is based upon an ignorance of the history of the Great Northern Coalfield, the early railways of the Great Northern Coalfield. Now, was this just some act of neglect by the historians of the Stockton-Darlington Railway? Or are we dealing with something more sinister here? Dare I mention the word fraud? Dare I mention the word manipulation? Well, we'll look at that later. But first of all, let's just have a look at the ending of Stephenson's career. Next line, of course, is the Manchester and Liverpool. Now, this is a real railway. Nobody could have chosen this of being a colliery line, like the Stockton and Darlington was. The revenues for the Manchester and Liverpool were very largely made up of passenger traffic, and I think I remember correctly, there was something like £1,000 on the revenue for the first year. But it was a double track. It used railway steam locomotives throughout. It had signalling and so forth. That is what we would recognise as a railway of today. And of course, Stephenson doesn't stop there. He continues with the London to Birmingham line, and then of course we wouldn't forget his ventures abroad to Europe and elsewhere. And so, if we answer the question, what is the significance of Hetton Railway, the first railway to be built by George Stephenson, and the important path of North East's great gift to the world, the railway and the steam locomotive. I think that's an amazing achievement for Stephenson, and I think it's an amazing achievement for Hetton. Now, Mr. Chairman, I have, I think, gone on too long, but have I time to mention the bombshell? Thank you. Let us fast forward now from 1822, 1825, through the age of the massive Victorian railway revolution, the railway mania, into the celebration, the Jubilee celebrations. What happened at Hetton in 1872? Nothing. In fact, when I asked myself the question, what happened at any railway at the Jubilee before 1875, I think the answer is nothing. Because the good folks of Hetton simply got on running their railway and running their mine and making their money as they had done since 1822. Now, if we go forward to 1875, a great deal happens. First of all, I should have mentioned that in 1853, the North Eastern Railway was formed, and the Stockton-Darlington was, 1854 the railway was formed, and the Stockton and Darlington was swallowed up into the North East in 1863. And a little over a decade later, the 43rd biannual board meeting takes place of the North Eastern Railway. And it is suggested that the railway has a Jubilee celebration. And they cough up £5,000 for this. And the man they put in charge is a vice chairman, a member of the Pease family. And he does a number of things. He suggests that we have a great railway cavalcade at North Road Works. He suggests that we unveil a statue. Guess who? Pease. We have a portrait painted and presented to Pease. We have a great banquet organised. We have a list of excursions according to places like Saltburn, which was created by the Stockton and Darlington Railway, produced. And of course, we produce a book, the history book of the railways. Now, I'm sorry, but I'm going to have to read this because I must get the evidence accurate. The title of the book is The Jubilee Memorial of the Railway System, and the history of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. And it's to be written by George Stevens Jeans, who was the 29-year-old editor of the Darlington and Stockton Times. Now, if you know anything about the history of newspapers in the 19th century, you will know that the editors were not the paragons of objectivity that we've come to accept today. Now, surprise, surprise. This book is dedicated to Henry Pease, the man who's coughing out the money through the NER for the book. And it's dedicated to Henry Pease, who is described as the only surviving son of the father of the railways. No, not Stephenson, Edward Pease. Surprise, surprise. And these books were given to all of the guests at the great banquet that was held. And these were people from not only railway fraternity in Britain, but elsewhere. So they all get the accepted copy of the Bible given to them. Now, one or two interesting quotes from this book to send you home in fighting spirit for Hetton. Jeans tells us that 50 years ago, that's 1825, the railway interest employed less than 300 hands. Now that's really interesting, that. Less than 300 hands. God, there must have been some hard-working people. If you know anything about railways at the beginning of the 19th century, to do it with 300 hands is a miracle. Particularly when we pick up report, like the 1792 report on the coal trade, which gives us the total number of people employed on the River Wear. And we discover in 1892, mark you, there were wagon smiths, there were wagon wheelwrights, there were engine men, there were wagon men, and there were creasers, pay-way men, totaling 780. And there would have been a lot more on the River Tyne. So where does he get this figure, 300, from? Well, of course, he's just talking about Stockton, isn't he? And one or two others, like the Surrey Iron Railway, I suppose. Now, what's also very interesting, in fact, it reveals the source of the problem we've had in the historiography of railways. It springs from the introduction. He tells us that the book contains brief biographical sketches of the pioneers of the railway system and a short historical sketch of the birthplace of the railway. Now, what's interesting about this, and I should tell you that the biographical sketch is a list of the people that are running the Stockton Down Railway. What's interesting about this is that we see here the translation of the railway system into the railway. What he means by the railway system is another issue. But can you see the point I'm making? He from the very beginning, we get this belief that not the railway system, but the railway starts in 1825. And I hope that I've shown you something to question that view. And I hope that you will forget about the diminished treatment that Hetton has had in the historiography of railways. Because you've had this conference, take your banner and go out and fight for Hetton.